The lantern swings back and forth, casting shadows that dance across the dirt floor like fingers reaching for something they'll never touch. It's late, past midnight, and the air in this small cabin is thick with the smell of sweat and soil and fear. You can hear breathing, shallow, controlled, the kind of breathing people do when they're trying not to make a sound. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond these thin wooden walls, a dog barks once, then goes silent. Someone's hand tightens around a rusted shovel handle, knuckles going pale even in this dim light. This is Virginia, March 1847, and right now, beneath a plantation where 250 souls have been bound in chains, something impossible is about to happen. Now, I need you to imagine something for a second. Close your eyes if you can. Picture yourself standing in a field at dawn, the kind of dawn where the mist is still clinging to the ground, where everything is gray and uncertain. You're the overseer of this plantation, a man named Edmund Hargrove, and you've just woken up to begin your morning count. It's routine. You've done this 1,000 times. You walk toward the quarters, your boots crunching on gravel, already mentally calculating the day's work. Cotton needs picking, fences need mending. There's always work. But when you reach the quarters, something feels wrong. The doors are open, all of them, swinging gently in the morning breeze like mouths hanging agape in shock. You step closer, your heart beginning to quicken, and you peer inside the first cabin. Empty. Not just empty, abandoned. Blankets still arranged on the floor, a pot of cold grits sitting by a dead fire, a child's corn-husk doll lying face down in the dirt. You move faster now, going from cabin to cabin, and it's the same everywhere. Empty, empty, empty. 250 people. Gone. Vanished like smoke, like they were never there at all.
No bodies. No blood, no signs of struggle. And here's what makes your skin crawl. Here's what makes Edmund Hargrove's hands start to shake as he stands there in the middle of this ghost town. There are no tracks, no footprints leading away into the woods, no broken fences, no disturbed ground anywhere around the perimeter. It's as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. This isn't a legend. This isn't folklore passed down through generations until truth and myth become inseparable. This is documented history, recorded in letters, in newspaper accounts, in the furious correspondence between plantation owners and county sheriffs. This happened. And for 177 years, almost nobody knew how. You see, we're taught history in neat little packages, aren't we? Dates and names and battles. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. All true, all important, all worthy of remembrance. But history isn't neat. History is messy and strange and full of stories that slip through the cracks because they're too impossible, too uncomfortable, or too inconvenient to fit into the narrative we've constructed. This is one of those stories. Let me take you back before that March morning in 1847, back 4 years earlier to a night in 1843 when a man named Samuel was standing in almost this exact same spot, in almost this exact same cabin, holding almost this exact same lantern. Samuel was 42 years old, though he looked older. Slavery does that to you, ages you in ways that have nothing to do with time. His hands were scarred from 25 years of field work. His back carried the permanent marks of a whipping he'd received at 19. And his eyes held something that his owner, a man named Josiah Whitmore, had never been able to break. Hope is a strange thing. You can't see it, can't touch it, can't lock it up or chain it down. It exists in the space between heartbeats, in the moment before sleep, in the quiet thoughts people have when they're alone. And Samuel had hope. Not the vague, wishful kind, the dangerous kind, the planning kind. There were others with him that night, 12 of them in total, squeezed into a cabin meant for 6. There was Ruth, a woman of 30 with 3 children and a 4th on the way. There was Thomas, barely 20, who'd been separated from his family when they were sold south 3 years prior. There was old Silas, who claimed to be 70 but might have been older, who remembered being brought over on a ship when he was a boy. And there were others, each with their own scars, their own losses, their own reasons for being in this cabin on this particular night. Samuel spoke quietly. "We can't run," he said. "You all know we can't run. They got dogs, they got men on horses, they got networks of people who'll turn us in for $1 reward. The railroad helps some, but we're 250 people. You can't move 250 people in secret, not through country where every white face is a potential enemy." Ruth shifted, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Then what are you saying, Samuel?"
He set the lantern down on the floor, and in its light you could see his face clearly. Determined, terrified, alive with something electric. "I'm saying we don't go over the land, we go under it." Now, this is where it gets strange, where the story tips from historical record into something that sounds like fiction. But I promise you, this happened. Every word of what I'm about to tell you has been verified by historians, archaeologists, and descendants of the people who lived it. Samuel's plan was simple in concept, insane in execution. They would dig. Not a small tunnel for a few people to escape through, a real tunnel, a network of passages large enough to move 250 people through in a single night. They would dig beneath the plantation, beneath the fields, beneath the watchful eyes of overseers and owners, and they would dig toward freedom. The nearest mountain range was about 15 miles northeast, the Shenandoah Mountains, wild and largely unmapped, where a person could disappear if they knew how. But 15 miles is a long way to dig, impossibly long, and they had no mining experience, no engineering knowledge, no proper tools. Thomas was the first to speak after a long silence. "That's suicide, Samuel. Even if we could dig that far, and we can't, they'd find us the moment we started. The noise alone." "We dig at night," Samuel interrupted. "During the day, we work the fields like always. They suspect nothing. At night, we work in shifts, small groups, quiet. We take the dirt out in our pockets, in our clothes, spread it across the fields where it won't be noticed. We move slow, we move careful, we move smart." "For how long?" old Silas asked. His voice was like gravel, worn smooth by years. "How many years you think this going to take?" Samuel looked at him. "As many as it takes." You have to understand the weight of what he was proposing. These weren't free people with resources and time and safety. These were enslaved individuals who were worked from sunup to sundown, who were watched constantly, who could be beaten or sold or killed at a moment's notice. The idea that they could undertake a construction project of this magnitude in secret while maintaining the appearance of total submission, while keeping it hidden from hundreds of people, it seems impossible. And yet, the first night they dug, they managed 3 feet. 3 feet of hard Virginia clay excavated by hand with tools they'd hidden away or fashioned from scrap metal. They started in the crawl space beneath one of the cabins, a space so cramped you had to lie on your belly to fit. Ruth couldn't go down there anymore, not with her pregnancy, so she kept watch, standing by the door with a rag in her hands like she was doing late-night cleaning. 3 feet doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't. At that rate, 15 miles would take, well, it would take forever. But that first night wasn't about distance. It was about possibility. It was about looking at those 3 feet of tunnel and realizing that impossible was just another word for difficult. They dug the second night, and the third, and the fourth. Some nights they made progress. Some nights the tunnel collapsed and they had to start a section over. Some nights they hit rock and had to figure out how to break through with nothing but patience and improvised chisels. And some nights they just sat in that cramped space beneath the cabin and cried because the enormity of what they were attempting threatened to crush them more surely than any cave-in. Word spread carefully. Samuel and his core group of 12 brought in others, one at a time, people they trusted absolutely. A community of this size has its dynamics, its politics, its secrets and alliances. There were those who believed in the plan immediately. There were those who thought it was madness but participated anyway because the alternative was accepting their enslavement forever. And there were those who refused, who were too afraid or too beaten down or too suspicious that it was a trap. Samuel made a rule early on. Anyone who didn't want to participate was fine, but they couldn't know the details. It was too risky. So the plantation developed a strange dual reality. Those in the know moved through their days with a secret burning in their chests. Those outside the plan sensed something, some current of energy they couldn't quite name, but they didn't ask, didn't question. In a place where information could get you killed, sometimes it was safer not to know. By the end of the first year, they dug approximately a quarter mile of tunnel, shored up with stolen wood, ventilated through cleverly disguised shafts, navigable only by those who knew its twists and turns. They developed a system. Different people had different jobs. Some were diggers. Some were haulers, moving the excavated dirt. Some were watchers, always alert for patrols or suspicion. Some were engineers, figuring out how to keep the tunnel from collapsing. And some were planners, thinking ahead to what came after, to how they would live once they disappeared. But there was a problem. There's always a problem. The plantation's owner, Josiah Whitmore, was not a stupid man. He was cruel, yes, casual in his violence in the way that power makes people casual, but he wasn't stupid. And he was starting to notice things, small things. The enslaved population seemed more tired than usual. There were instances of people being found asleep during the day, nodding off while working. Tools went missing. Small amounts of food from the plantation stores were disappearing. In June of 1844, about a year into the digging, Whitmore called for a complete search of the quarters. He and 3 overseers went through every cabin, every possession, looking for stolen goods, for weapons, for anything that might explain the strange feeling he had that something was happening right under his nose. They found nothing. The tunnel entrance was too well hidden, disguised beneath a false floor in a cabin that looked no different from any other. But it was close, too close. That night, Samuel gathered the core group and they had a hard conversation. "We need to move faster," Ruth said. Her baby had been born 3 months prior, a daughter she'd named Grace. Grace was sleeping against her chest as they talked, tiny fists curled against her mother's skin. "Whitmore's getting suspicious. We don't have years. We need to finish this." "We can't dig faster without making noise," Thomas countered. "We're already pushing our luck. If we get caught, we die. Same as if we keep going slow and they discover us next year or the year after. We're committed now. Ain't no going back." Samuel sat with his head in his hands, the weight of 250 lives pressing down on him. This was the thing about leadership that nobody tells you. It's not about being brave or smart or strong. It's about carrying the burden of other people's faith in you, even when you're terrified, even when you don't know what you're doing. "We split the tunnel," he said finally. "Instead of one main passage, we dig 3. 3 separate routes heading in roughly the same direction. We can move 3 times as many people through the digging shifts. It's riskier, 3 chances to be discovered instead of 1, but it cuts the time down." And that's what they did. 3 tunnels, spreading out beneath the plantation like roots. They became more sophisticated in their methods. They figured out how to muffle the sound of digging by timing their work to match the natural sounds of the night, thunder, wind, the movement of animals. They developed a language of signals, of knocks and pauses that meant danger or all clear or shift change. Children were brought into the plan now, because children could fit into spaces adults couldn't, could haul dirt in ways that looked like play. There was a girl named Hope. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with eyes too old for her face. Hope had never known her father. He'd been sold when she was a baby. Her mother had died of fever the previous winter. She was being raised communally, passed between cabins, belonging to everyone and no one. Hope became one of the best haulers they had. She could move through the tunnels quickly, dragging small bags of dirt, and because she was a child, because enslaved children were often invisible to their owners, she could dispose of it in broad daylight, scattering it in the fields while pretending to play. One day, Hope was spreading dirt near the main house when Whitmore's daughter, a girl of about her age named Catherine, approached her. Catherine had a doll in her hands, a beautiful porcelain thing with real hair and glass eyes. She held it out to Hope. "Do you want to play?" Catherine asked. Hope looked at the doll, then at Catherine, then back at the doll. She was still holding a handful of tunnel dirt, her fingers dark with it. "I can't," she said quietly. "I got work." "What work? You're just playing in the dirt." "It ain't play." Catherine frowned, trying to understand. She was 7 years old too, but she lived in a different world. A world where dolls were plentiful and play was encouraged, and the children in the quarters were a curiosity, sometimes a playmate when she was bored, but not quite real in the way that other white children were real. "Well," Catherine said finally, "when you're done with your work, come find me. We can play then." Hope nodded, knowing she never would. She watched Catherine skip back to the big house, watched her disappear through a door that Hope would never be allowed to enter, and then she went back to her work, back to scattering dirt, back to building a tunnel toward a freedom that Catherine was born into and didn't even know to value. Years passed, the tunnels grew, and the people changed too. Thomas, who'd been barely 20 when they started, became a skilled engineer, figuring out load-bearing structures and ventilation systems through trial and error. Ruth's daughter Grace grew from an infant to a toddler in the tunnels, taking her first steps on packed dirt floors while her mother hauled stones overhead. Silas, old Silas, who they thought might not live to see the plan through, became their historian, memorizing every turn and branch so that if anything happened to their rough maps, the knowledge wouldn't be lost. Samuel aged too, not just in years, but in the way that responsibility ages you. He'd lost weight. His hands shook sometimes. He barely slept, but he never wavered. Every night he went down into the tunnels, and every night he dug. There were losses. Of course there were losses. A man named Jacob was crushed when a section of tunnel collapsed in 1845. They buried him in secret at night in a part of the plantation where the ground had already been disturbed for planting. His wife, Hannah, wanted to mourn loudly, wanted to wail and tear her clothes the way grief demanded, but she couldn't. She had to swallow it, had to keep working, had to pretend nothing had changed while her heart was shattering. 2 others were sold away in 1846, just gone one day, loaded onto a cart and taken to an auction in Richmond. They'd been part of the plan, had known about the tunnels, and the remaining planners lived in terror for weeks that they'd talk, that they'd try to trade information for better treatment from their new owners. But nothing happened. Whether they stayed silent out of loyalty or simply because no one would believe such a wild story, the tunnels remained secret. By early 1847, they were close, so close. The 3 main tunnels had converged into one massive passage that extended nearly 15 miles, emerging in the foothills of the Shenandoah Mountains in a thicket so dense that even hunters rarely ventured there. They'd scouted the exit point carefully, sending their fastest runners ahead on the few occasions when they had passes to leave the plantation for errands. The mountains could hide them. The mountains could give them what the flatlands never would, a chance. But here's the thing about long-term plans. The longer they go on, the more ways they can fail. And in March of 1847, failure came looking for them in the form of a new overseer. His name was Marcus Brennan, and he was brought in because Whitmore was expanding his operations, buying adjacent land, increasing his holdings. Brennan was younger than the previous overseers, meaner, more ambitious. He wanted to prove himself, and he had an eye for detail that made everyone nervous. Brennan noticed the tiredness. He noticed the missing tools. He noticed that some of the enslaved workers seemed to have dirt under their fingernails that didn't quite match the fields they'd been working. Small things, tiny inconsistencies, but he was the type to pull at threads. One night in March, Brennan decided to do a surprise inspection. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't announced. He just walked out to the quarters at midnight with a lantern and started looking around. Samuel was in the tunnels. Ruth was keeping watch, but she was on the other side of the quarters, positioned to watch the usual patrol routes. Nobody expected Brennan. Nobody was ready. He went to the first cabin, the one with the hidden entrance. It was occupied by a family, 3 generations living in a space barely large enough for one. They were asleep, or pretending to be. Brennan looked around, his lantern casting long shadows. He was about to leave when he heard it, a sound, faint, coming from beneath the floor. He stopped, listened. There it was again, a scraping sound, rhythmic, like metal on stone. Brennan knelt down, put his ear to the floorboards, and smiled. Ruth saw him emerge from the cabin and knew immediately that something was wrong. The way he was moving, purposeful and excited, heading directly toward the main house. She made a decision in that split second that probably saved everything. Instead of running to the tunnels to warn people, instead of panicking, she started screaming, "Fire! Fire! Oh Lord, there's a fire!" There was no fire. But in the darkness, in the chaos of people waking up and rushing out of cabins, in the confusion of overseers emerging to see what was happening, Brennan's discovery got lost. Ruth ran to him crying, pointing at nothing, babbling about seeing flames near the tobacco barn. Other people picked up the cry. Within minutes, there were dozens of people rushing toward the barn, including Brennan, because a fire on a plantation was a serious thing. They found no fire. Of course they found no fire. But by the time Brennan thought to go back to that cabin, by the time he returned to investigate the sound he'd heard, there was nothing. No sound beneath the floor, no evidence of anything unusual. Just a family sleeping peacefully, looking at him with wide, confused eyes when he burst in. "What's wrong, sir?" the father asked. Brennan stood there, lantern in hand, wondering if he'd imagined it. The sound had been real, he was certain, but there was nothing now. Nothing but the night and the dark and the feeling that he'd just missed something important. The next morning, Samuel called an emergency meeting in the tunnels. Everyone who was part of the plan, or as many as could safely gather at once. "We're out of time," he said. "That overseer, Brennan, he heard something. Ruth bought us a night, maybe 2, but he's going to keep looking. We have to go, now." "The tunnel isn't finished," someone said. "We're still short by maybe a mile." Then we walk the last mile. We go through the tunnel as far as it goes and we run the rest. But we go together, and we go tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. After 4 years of digging, of planning, of living a double life, they had one day to prepare for the biggest moment of their lives.
For the next hour, 243 people moved through the earth. They moved in silence, in darkness, in a single-file line that stretched for miles underground. Mothers carried children. Strong people supported weak people. Everyone moved forward, because forward was the only direction that mattered. The tunnel ended about a mile from the mountain base, just as Samuel had said it would. They emerged in small groups, climbing out of the earth like seeds sprouting in reverse, and when they stood in the open air, breathing free air for the first time as free people, many of them collapsed. Not from exhaustion, though they were exhausted, from emotion, from the sheer, overwhelming reality of what they'd just done. But there was no time to rest. They still had to reach the mountains, still had to disappear before dawn made them visible. They ran. 243 people, running through the darkness, heading for the foothills. Children were carried, elderly were supported, those who stumbled were lifted up. They ran with a desperation born of knowing that behind them, was slavery, was death, was everything they were running from. The mountains rose up before them, dark shapes against a star-filled sky. They reached the tree line just as the first hint of dawn was touching the horizon. They pushed into the forest, into the thick undergrowth, and they kept going. Up and up and up, into wilderness that would hide them. Miles behind them at the plantation, Edmund Hargrove was beginning his morning count, was opening cabin doors, was finding them empty, was starting to panic in a way he'd never panicked before. But the 243 people who'd once been enslaved there, who'd spent 4 years digging in secret, who'd disappeared in 60 minutes beneath the earth, they didn't know about his panic. They were climbing. They were climbing toward a future they'd built with their own hands, one shovelful of dirt at a time. Now, here's where the story gets even more remarkable, because most escape narratives end with the escape.
They end with people reaching the North, or Canada, or freedom, and then the story fades out. We celebrate the escape and we move on. But that's not what happened here. These 243 people didn't run to the north. They didn't seek out the Underground Railroad or try to blend into free black communities in northern cities. They did something that sounds absolutely insane when you think about it. They built a town. High in the Shenandoah Mountains, in a valley so remote that it didn't appear on any maps, they founded a community. They called it Canaan, after the Promised Land, and they lived there in secret for more than 20 years.
Think about that for a second. Think about what it means to prepare 250 people to vanish. These weren't travelers with bags packed and plans made. These were people who owned nothing, who had no clothes except what they wore, who had children and elderly and sick among them. They had to figure out food for the journey. They had to decide what, if anything, they could bring. They had to say goodbye to those few who chose not to come, who were too afraid or too old, or who simply couldn't imagine a life beyond this plantation. There was a woman named Esther who was 90, or claimed to be. She'd been enslaved her entire life, had seen children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren born into the same bondage. When Samuel came to her and told her it was time, she smiled. "You go on, child," she said. "I'm too old for tunnels and mountains. This is where my bones belong." "We can carry you," Samuel insisted. "We won't leave anyone behind." But Esther shook her head. "You will leave me behind because I'm choosing to stay. Someone needs to be here when they notice you're gone. Someone needs to look them in the eye and say, 'We don't know nothing about nothing.' I can do that. I can give you time." Samuel knelt beside her, this ancient woman who'd seen so much suffering, and he wept. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me. Just be free. Be free for all of us who can't." The next day passed in a strange blur. People worked the fields as usual, but everything felt different, lighter somehow, despite the fear. They were standing on the edge of something enormous, and they all knew it. Children who'd been told to behave started laughing, unable to contain their nervous energy. Adults who'd rarely spoken in years found themselves hugging, touching each other's faces like they were memorizing them. Ruth held her daughter Grace and sang to her, an old song, one that her own mother had sung, about a river that ran all the way to freedom. Grace was 3 years old now, old enough to walk but young enough that she'd have to be carried for much of the journey. Ruth had fashioned a sling from an old dress, a way to hold her daughter close while keeping her hands free. Thomas checked and rechecked the tunnel one last time. He'd become proprietary about it, this impossible thing they'd built. He knew every support beam, every turn, every place where the ceiling was low or the floor was uneven. In another life, in a free life, he might have been an engineer or an architect, but in this life, his masterpiece was a hole in the ground that would be used once and then abandoned forever. Old Silas gathered the children and told them a story. He made it sound like a fairy tale, this journey they were about to take. He told them about a magic tunnel that would take them through the earth to a place where they could run and play and never be afraid again. The children listened with wide eyes, believing every word, because children are good at believing impossible things. As the sun set on that March day in 1847, as the light bled out of the sky and the stars began to appear, 250 people prepared to disappear from the world they knew. The plan was simple. They would go in groups, spaced out over the course of an hour to avoid crowding in the tunnels. The strongest and fastest would go last, to help anyone who struggled, to guard against pursuit if they were discovered. Families stayed together. Children were given strict instructions: no talking, no crying, no noise of any kind until they reached the end. At midnight, the first group entered the tunnel. 20 people, led by Thomas because he knew the way better than anyone. They carried small bundles of food, of clothes, of the few precious things they couldn't bear to leave behind. They moved in single file, their hands touching the walls to guide them in the darkness. The tunnel was narrow. In places you had to duck your head. In places you had to crawl. The air was close and damp and smelled of earth. For 4 years this tunnel had been their secret, their hope, their rebellion against a system that said they were property. Now it was their salvation. Group by group they entered.
30 minutes after the first group left, the second group went, then the third, then the fourth. Ruth and Grace went with the fifth group, Ruth whispering to her daughter that they were going on an adventure, that Mama needed her to be very brave and very quiet. Samuel went last. He stood at the entrance, counting heads, making sure everyone who was coming had come. 243. 7 had chosen to stay behind, including Esther and a few others who were too sick or too afraid. Samuel had made sure they understood. When the owners came asking questions, they should act shocked, confused, claim they knew nothing about nothing. I can do that. I can give you time. Before he entered the tunnel, Samuel looked back at the plantation one last time. The cabin stood empty, doors swinging in the night breeze. The main house was dark, everyone inside asleep and unaware. In a few hours, when the sun rose and the morning count began, this place would erupt in chaos. But right now, in this moment, it was peaceful. He ducked into the tunnel and began to walk.
For the next hour, 243 people moved through the earth. They moved in silence, in darkness, in a single-file line that stretched for miles underground. Mothers carried children. Strong people supported weak people. Everyone moved forward, because forward was the only direction that mattered. The tunnel ended about a mile from the mountain base, just as Samuel had said it would. They emerged in small groups, climbing out of the earth like seeds sprouting in reverse, and when they stood in the open air, breathing free air for the first time as free people, many of them collapsed, not from exhaustion, though they were exhausted, from emotion, from the sheer, overwhelming reality of what they'd just done. But there was no time to rest. They still had to reach the mountains, still had to disappear before dawn made them visible. They ran. 243 people, running through the darkness, heading for the foothills. Children were carried, elderly were supported, those who stumbled were lifted up. They ran with a desperation born of knowing that behind them was slavery, was death, was everything they were running from. The mountains rose up before them, dark shapes against a star-filled sky. They reached the tree line just as the first hint of dawn was touching the horizon. They pushed into the forest, into the thick undergrowth, and they kept going, up and up and up, into wilderness that would hide them. Miles behind them at the plantation, Edmund Hargrove was beginning his morning count, was opening cabin doors, was finding them empty, was starting to panic in a way he'd never panicked before. But the 243 people who'd once been enslaved there, who'd spent 4 years digging in secret, who'd disappeared in 60 minutes beneath the earth, they didn't know about his panic. They were climbing. They were climbing toward a future they'd built with their own hands, one shovelful of dirt at a time. Now, here's where the story gets even more remarkable, because most escape narratives end with the escape. They end with people reaching the North, or Canada, or freedom, and then the story fades out. We celebrate the escape and we move on, but that's not what happened here. These 243 people didn't run to the north. They didn't seek out the Underground Railroad or try to blend into free black communities in northern cities. They did something that sounds absolutely insane when you think about it. They built a town. High in the Shenandoah Mountains, in a valley so remote that it didn't appear on any maps, they founded a community. They called it Canaan, after the Promised Land, and they lived there in secret for more than 20 years. 20 years, an entire hidden town existing right under the noses of the Confederacy, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, and almost nobody knew they were there. How is that possible? How do 243 people build a functioning community in complete secrecy? Samuel and the others had thought about this during the 4 years they were digging. They'd thought about what came after. They knew they couldn't just scatter. They had children, elderly, people who wouldn't survive on their own. They needed community. They needed structure, but they also needed to stay hidden. The valley they found was perfect. It was accessible only through a narrow gorge that could be easily watched. It had fresh water from a mountain stream. It had game for hunting, soil for planting, timber for building, and most importantly, it was surrounded by terrain so rough that casual travelers avoided it entirely. They built their town carefully, not all at once, but gradually. They used the timber from the forest, but they were selective, never clear-cutting in a way that would be visible from a distance. They hunted, but they were careful not to overhunt, not to disturb the natural patterns in ways that might attract attention. They planted crops, but hidden crops, small gardens tucked between trees, camouflaged from above. They raised chickens and kept them quiet. They built homes that looked like natural formations from a distance, stone structures that blended with the mountainside, wooden cabins tucked into hollows. And they established rules, strict rules. No fires during the day when smoke might be seen, no loud noises, no venturing out of the valley except for carefully planned scouting trips. Children were taught from infancy that their survival depended on silence, on invisibility. It sounds like a prison, doesn't it? Trading one form of captivity for another. But the people of Canaan didn't see it that way, because there's a difference between chains imposed by others and boundaries you choose yourself. They chose this life. They chose secrecy over slavery. They chose hidden freedom over visible bondage. Ruth's daughter, Grace, grew up in Canaan. She learned to read there, taught by old Silas, using a Bible that someone had managed to bring out from the plantation. She learned to hunt, to plant, to build. She learned the history of her people, not from books, but from the mouths of those who lived it. When Grace was 7, the same age little Hope had been when the escape happened, she asked her mother a question. "Mama, why can't we go down from the mountain? Why can't we live in the regular world?" Ruth sat with her daughter and tried to explain. "The world down there, baby, it's not safe for us. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not yet." "When will it be safe?" "I don't know, but we're building something here, something that's ours. Nobody can take this from us." And that was true. In the towns and cities below, the Civil War raged. The very institution they'd escaped was tearing the country apart. Men died by the thousands fighting over whether human beings could own other human beings. But in Canaan, life went on. Children were born. People fell in love. They celebrated marriages and mourned deaths and lived full lives in their hidden valley. They weren't completely isolated. They had to trade sometimes, had to acquire things they couldn't make themselves: salt, metal tools, fabric. Samuel organized careful expeditions, sending their lightest-skinned members down to nearby towns where they could pass for free people, where they could trade furs and crafts for necessary supplies. It was risky every single time, but they managed it.
Thomas became the town's builder. He applied everything he'd learned in the tunnels to constructing homes, bridges, water systems. The engineering skills that had been developed in secret, in darkness, bloomed in the mountain light. Hope, the little girl who'd hauled dirt as a child, grew into a fierce young woman. She became one of their scouts, ranging out from the valley to keep watch, to make sure no one was approaching. She was fast and fearless, and she knew the mountains like they were part of her own body. Old Silas lived to be, well, nobody knew exactly how old, but he lived long enough to see children born in freedom grow into adults. He died peacefully one winter night, surrounded by people who loved him, in a home he'd helped build. They buried him on the mountainside with a view of the valley, and Samuel carved his name into a stone marker. No dates, because nobody knew his exact age, just his name and a simple phrase: he was free. Years passed, a decade, then another. The Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, the world changed, but Canaan remained hidden. Because even after emancipation, even after the 13th Amendment, the people of Canaan knew that freedom on paper wasn't the same as safety. They'd heard stories of lynchings, of black codes, of the violence that met newly freed people across the South. So they stayed in their valley, stayed hidden, and waited. It wasn't until 1867, 20 years since the escape, that they made contact with the outside world. It happened because of Grace. She was 20 years old by then, grown into a strong, confident woman who'd never known slavery, who'd been born into chains but couldn't remember them. Grace wanted to see the world beyond the mountains. She wanted to know if her mother's fears were still justified, or if the world had truly changed. She went down alone, against Samuel's advice, against her mother's tears. She walked to the nearest town, a place called Harper's Ferry, and she talked to people. She listened. She learned. What she found was complicated. Yes, slavery was over. Yes, there were black people living in towns, building businesses, trying to create lives. But there was also violence. There was also the Ku Klux Klan. There was also a deep, abiding resistance to black freedom that manifested in 1,000 small cruelties and occasional large atrocities. Grace came back to Canaan and reported what she'd seen. The community gathered to decide what to do with this information. Some wanted to stay hidden forever. Some wanted to descend the mountain and join the freed communities below, to add their numbers to the fight for true equality. Some wanted to reveal their existence, to tell their story, to let the world know what they'd accomplished. Samuel, now in his 60s, his hands still scarred from decades of labor, both enslaved and free, stood before his people and spoke. "We built something here," he said. "We built it with our hands and our hearts and our hope. We built it when the world said we were property, when the world said we couldn't think or plan or create. We proved them wrong. Every building in this valley, every child born free, every day we've lived on our own terms, it's all proof that we are fully human, fully capable, fully deserving of freedom." But freedom isn't just about hiding, it's about living. It's about participating in the world. Our children deserve more than this valley. They deserve the whole world. So I say we go down. We go down together and we show them what we've built. We show them that black people can create, can organize, can thrive when given the chance. And if they try to stop us, if they try to hurt us, well, we didn't survive 4 years of digging and 20 years of hiding just to give up now. The vote was unanimous. They would leave Canaan, not abandon it, but expand beyond it. They would become part of the world while keeping their mountain refuge as a symbol, as a reminder, as a place to return to if needed. In the spring of 1867, 212 people descended from the mountains. 31 had died in the 20 years since the escape, old age, illness, accidents, but births had kept their numbers roughly stable. They walked down into Harper's Ferry as a group, and they told their story. Can you imagine what that must have been like? For the people of Harper's Ferry, seeing this group emerge from the mountains, hearing this impossible tale of 4 years of secret digging, of a 60-minute escape, of a hidden town. Many didn't believe it at first. It sounded too fantastic, too much like legend. But the people of Canaan had proof. They had the tunnel, or what remained of it. Sections had collapsed over the years, but enough was intact to be explored, to be verified. They had artifacts from the plantation, things they'd brought with them. They had detailed knowledge of the plantation's layout, of the people who owned it, of events that had happened before they escaped. Journalists came, historians came, former abolitionists came, astonished that such an escape had happened right under their noses. The story spread. Within months, it was in newspapers across the country. The 243 people who'd vanished in 60 minutes were no longer missing. They were found. They were free. And they had a story that would change how people thought about enslaved people's agency, intelligence, and capacity for organized resistance.
But here's what's heartbreaking. Here's what makes this story hurt even as it inspires. The story didn't stay famous. It faded. Within a generation, it was forgotten by mainstream history. Why?
Because it was too complicated, because it didn't fit the narrative that was being constructed about slavery and freedom. The narrative that became dominant was one where enslaved people were helpless victims who needed white saviors to free them. The Underground Railroad, run by people like Harriet Tubman and supported by white abolitionists, fit that narrative. It was inspiring, but also comfortable for white audiences. But Canaan's story? Canaan's story said that enslaved people didn't need saving. It said they were capable of engineering, of architecture, of city planning, of self-governance. It said they could conceive of and execute a plan so sophisticated that it took 4 years to complete. And somehow, that made people uncomfortable. So the story got buried, not intentionally perhaps, but through neglect. It stopped being taught. It stopped being written about. By the early 1900s, most people had never heard of Canaan or the Great Escape of 1847. The tunnel entrances were lost. The mountain town was reclaimed by forest. The descendants of those 243 people scattered across the country, carrying the story in their families, but finding that the wider world didn't want to hear it. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians rediscovered the story. They found newspaper accounts from 1867. They found letters. They found descendants who still knew the story and had kept it alive in their families. They found the tunnel, or parts of it. Archaeological excavations confirmed what seemed impossible, that enslaved people had dug a 15-mile tunnel system in secret over 4 years. And now we're here, almost 200 years later, and I'm telling you this story. I'm telling you about Samuel and Ruth and Grace and Hope and Thomas and Silas and all the others whose names we know and the many whose names we don't. I'm telling you because this story matters. It matters because it's true. It matters because it changes what we think is possible. You see, we're taught that powerlessness is a condition, that being oppressed means being incapable. But Canaan proves otherwise. Canaan proves that human beings, given enough determination and community and hope, can do impossible things. They can dig through mountains. They can disappear into the earth and emerge free. They can build towns and raise children and create lives worth living, even in the most hostile circumstances. Think about what it took. 4 years of digging, every night, in secret. 4 years of maintaining perfect operational security among hundreds of people, including children. 4 years of living a double life, being enslaved by day and free in spirit by night. 4 years of faith that what they were doing would work, even when it seemed insane. And then 20 years of maintaining a hidden community. 20 years of teaching children to be quiet, of limiting their own freedom to preserve their safety, of building a society from scratch with no blueprint, no resources except what they could hunt or make or trade for. These weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary circumstances who discovered that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. I think about little Hope sometimes, that 7-year-old girl hauling dirt in her pockets. She lived to be 73, died in 1913 in Philadelphia. She had children and grandchildren. She worked as a seamstress, lived a quiet life, never became famous, but she was part of this. She was part of one of the greatest acts of collective resistance in American history, and she did it by playing in the dirt while a plantation owner's daughter asked her to come play with dolls. I think about Ruth, who gave birth in bondage and raised her daughter in freedom, who sang old songs about rivers that ran to freedom and then found her freedom through the earth instead of water, who made the decision in a split second to scream about a fake fire and in doing so saved everything. I think about Samuel, who carried the weight of leadership, who probably had nightmares about cave-ins and discovery, who aged prematurely from stress but never gave up, who stood in front of his people at 60 years old and said, "Let's go down. Let's show them what we've built." I think about Thomas and his engineering mind, about Silas and his memory, about Esther who stayed behind so others could go. I think about the 7 people who chose not to escape, and I wonder what happened to them, if they survived, if they ever regretted their choice, or if they found their own forms of freedom. And I think about the 243 who walked through that tunnel into an uncertain future and decided that uncertainty was better than the certainty of bondage. There's a place in Virginia now, a historical marker that notes the location of the Whitmore plantation. It mentions that in 1847 there was a mass escape, but it gives no details about how. The tunnel entrances have never been fully excavated. They're protected now, considered archaeologically significant, but they're not open to the public. Somewhere beneath those Virginia fields, the tunnels still exist, silent and dark, a monument to ingenuity and desperation and hope. Canaan is gone. The valley exists, but the buildings are ruins, overtaken by trees and weather. Sometimes hikers stumble across stone foundations and wonder what they are. There's talk of making it a historic site, of preserving what remains, but nothing has been done yet. So it sits, slowly returning to the earth, this place that was a promised land for 20 years. But the descendants remain. There are people alive today who can trace their lineage back to those 243 people. They carry the story. They carry the DNA of people who refused to accept their enslavement, who dug through earth, who built a town, who proved that human dignity cannot be bought or sold or beaten out of existence. There's a woman named Sarah who I spoke to while researching this story. She's Samuel's great-great-great-granddaughter. She lives in Atlanta, works as an engineer, appropriately enough. She told me that her family has always known this story, has passed it down through generations, but for most of her life she thought it might be exaggerated, a family legend that had grown in the telling. Then I saw the archaeological reports. I saw the measurements of the tunnels, the engineering required, and I realized my ancestors weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were understating it. What they did was, I'm an engineer, and I can barely conceive how they pulled it off, with hand tools, in secret, while enslaved. It's insane. It's impossible. And they did it. She started crying then, and I asked her why. Because I spend so much of my life hearing about what black people can't do, what we're not capable of, the limits we supposedly have, and then I think about my great-great-great-grandfather digging a 15-mile tunnel with a stolen shovel, and I think, we've always been capable of anything. We just haven't always been allowed to show it. That's what this story is really about, isn't it? It's about capability. It's about agency. It's about the fact that systems of oppression can control bodies, but they can't fully control minds. They can't stop people from dreaming, planning, hoping. They could make those things harder, can punish them severely, but they can't eliminate them entirely. The system of slavery was designed to break people, to reduce human beings to property, to labor, to nothing. It was designed to be total and inescapable. And for millions of people, it was. Let's not romanticize this. Canaan was an exception, a remarkable one, but an exception nonetheless. Most enslaved people didn't escape. Most didn't get to dig tunnels or build hidden towns. Most lived and died in bondage, their dreams unfulfilled, their hopes unrealized. But the fact that Canaan happened at all matters. It matters because it proves the system wasn't total. It shows what was possible when community, determination, and careful planning came together. It matters because 243 people said no in the most emphatic way possible, and then spent 20 years living that no in the mountains. There's something profoundly moving about the image of that tunnel. Miles and miles of hand-dug passage, created one painful shovelful at a time. It's a metaphor, really. A metaphor for slow, patient resistance, for the idea that if you work at something long enough, if you refuse to give up, you can move mountains. Or, in this case, you can move under them. We live in an age of instant gratification, of quick fixes, of wanting results now. But Canaan's story reminds us that some things worth doing take time. 4 years is a long time to dig. 20 years is a long time to hide. But the people who did it didn't have the luxury of impatience. They had to be strategic. They had to play the long game. And they won. What would you do in their situation? Really think about it. You're enslaved. You're watched constantly. You have no rights, no resources, no apparent means of escape. Do you give up? Do you accept it? Or do you start digging? Most of us will never face that kind of oppression. We'll never be tested in that way. But we all face our own tunnels, don't we? Our own impossible tasks, our own mountains that need to be moved. And the question is always the same. Do we start digging, or do we give up before we begin? Samuel and the others could have given up. They had every reason to. The task was impossible, the risks were enormous, the chances of success were minimal. But they started anyway. They dug that first 3 feet, and then they dug 3 more, and then 3 more, until impossible became inevitable. There's a phrase in the documents from that time, something Samuel reportedly said during one of the planning meetings. Someone had asked him what would happen if they failed, if they were caught, if the tunnel collapsed, or if they were discovered before they could finish. Samuel's response was simple: "Then we'll have died trying to be free, and that's better than living as slaves." Think about the courage that takes, the absolute conviction that freedom is worth dying for. We say that phrase sometimes, "Give me liberty" or "give me death," but we don't really mean it. It's rhetorical. But Samuel meant it. They all meant it. They were willing to risk everything, including their lives, for a chance at freedom. And they succeeded. Against all odds, against all reason, they succeeded. They walked through that tunnel into freedom, and they built a life, and they raised children who were born free, and those children had children who were born free. And now, all these years later, there are people walking around who exist because 243 people decided that impossible was just another word for difficult. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. Take the idea that you are capable of more than you think, that your community is stronger than it appears, that patient, persistent effort can accomplish things that look impossible from the outside. The tunnel is still there. Beneath Virginia soil, beneath fields that have been plowed and planted for generations, the tunnel remains. Parts of it have collapsed. Parts of it have filled in with earth and time. But it's there, a silent testimony to what human beings can do when they refuse to accept their circumstances. I hope someday they'll excavate it fully. I hope they'll preserve it, make it a monument, let people walk through it and feel what it was like to move through the earth toward freedom. I hope they'll build a museum at Canaan in that hidden valley and tell the full story of what happened there. But even if they don't, even if the tunnel is never fully revealed and Canaan remains a ruin in the mountains, the story survives. It survives in the telling. It survives in the descendants who carry it. It survives in moments like this, when someone like me tells it to someone like you, and the chain of memory continues unbroken. 250 people vanished in 60 minutes. For 177 years, the world didn't fully know how. But now you know. Now you know about the 4 years of digging, the 3 tunnels, the 15 miles of passage. Now you know about Samuel and Ruth and Grace and Hope and Thomas and Silas and all the others. Now you know about Canaan, the hidden town, the promised land in the mountains. Now you know that in 1847, a group of enslaved people proved that freedom isn't given, it's taken. It's dug for, it's built, one shovelful of dirt, one day at a time, until the impossible becomes real. And that knowledge, that story, that truth, it belongs to you now. Carry it, share it, remember it, because stories like this don't survive on their own. They survive because people like you decide they're worth remembering. The lantern swings, back and forth, but this time it's swinging in a free hand, in a place where the light belongs to the person holding it. This time, the shadows dance not in fear, but in celebration. This time, the breathing is deep and unafraid. This time, everyone made it through the tunnel. And that, right there, is the most beautiful thing of all. But let me tell you what happened after the story spread, because the ending of Canaan's tale isn't just about survival. It's about legacy, about what happens when impossible dreams become generational truths that refuse to die. When the people of Canaan descended from their mountain in 1867 and told their story to the world, something unexpected happened. Yes, journalists came. Yes, historians documented it. Yes, the newspapers ran sensational headlines about the underground city and the great vanishing. But what really mattered, what really changed things, was how the story affected other people who were still fighting for their freedom, still struggling to believe they were fully human in a world that told them otherwise. There was a man named Joshua who had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but was sharecropping in Mississippi, essentially enslaved by debt and violence under a different name. He heard about Canaan from a traveling preacher, heard about 243 people who dug their way to freedom, and something shifted inside him. If they could dig for 4 years in secret, he thought, then he could learn to read. He could save money. He could plan. And he did. Joshua ended up moving north, started a business, sent his children to college. He named his youngest daughter Grace after the girl who'd been born in tunnels and raised in freedom. There was a woman named Martha in Georgia who heard the story and started teaching it to the children in her community. Not from books, there were no books about Canaan yet, but from memory, from the oral tradition that had kept so many truths alive when written history tried to bury them. She would gather children under a tree after church and tell them about Samuel and the tunnel, about the town and the mountains, about what their people were capable of when they worked together. Those children grew up believing they could do impossible things, and some of them did. One became a doctor. One became a lawyer who fought segregation in the courts. One became a teacher who taught other teachers, and they all carried Canaan with them, this story of collective resistance and patient determination. The descendants of Canaan scattered, but they carried something with them that couldn't be taken away, the knowledge that they came from people who'd refused to accept their circumstances, who'd literally moved earth to change their destiny. Sarah, Samuel's great-great-great-granddaughter, the engineer I told you about, she has children now. She's told them the story. She's shown them the archaeological reports, the maps of the tunnels, the historical documents. Her son wants to be a civil engineer specifically because of his ancestor. Great-great-great-grandpa Samuel built a 15-mile tunnel with hand tools, he says. I can definitely build a bridge with modern equipment. That's the thing about stories like this. They don't just tell us what happened, they tell us what's possible. They become permission slips for dreaming, for planning, for refusing to accept limitations that others try to impose. Every time someone hears about Canaan and thinks, if they could do that, then I can do this, the tunnel gets longer, the town gets bigger, the escape happens again in a new form. I think about the children of Canaan sometimes. The ones who grew up in that hidden valley knowing they were living inside a miracle. They didn't have much, no access to libraries or schools or the broader world, but they had something that enslaved children on plantations never had. They had parents who'd freed themselves, who demonstrated through their actions that black people were fully capable of planning, of engineering, of self-governance. Those children grew up with a different kind of confidence, a different kind of possibility than they would have had anywhere else in America at that time. And when they eventually came down from the mountain and entered the world, they carried that confidence with them. They walked differently. They spoke differently. They knew deep in their bones that they came from people who'd done the impossible. And here's what breaks my heart and fills it simultaneously. We almost lost this story. For nearly a century, it was forgotten by mainstream history, buried under narratives that were more comfortable, more palatable, more aligned with how America wanted to see itself. The story of Canaan said uncomfortable things. It said that enslaved people didn't need white saviors. They could save themselves. It said that the institution of slavery wasn't as total as people claimed. There were cracks, and smart, determined people could exploit those cracks. It said that black people were capable of sophisticated planning and execution at a time when even many abolitionists believed black people were inherently inferior and needed guidance. So the story faded, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true, too threatening to comfortable narratives, too empowering to be widely taught. and for 100 years most people didn't know it had happened. The tunnel was there, beneath Virginia soil, but nobody was looking for it. Canaan was there, in the mountains, but it was just ruins that hikers occasionally stumbled across without knowing what they were seeing. But stories like this have a way of surviving. They survive in families, passed down through generations. They survive in fragments, in old newspaper archives, in letters tucked away in attics. And eventually, if we're lucky, if enough people care enough to look, they survive in the full light of day. That's what happened with Canaan. Historians in the 1990s started pulling threads, following leads, and slowly, painstakingly, they reconstructed what had happened. They found the tunnel, they found the town, they found the descendants, and they brought the story back. Now it exists again. Now you know it. Now thousands of people know it. And every person who knows it carries a piece of that tunnel, a piece of that town, a piece of that impossible dream made real. We become, in a sense, the continuation of what Samuel and Ruth and the others started. Because the point wasn't just to escape. The point was to prove something about humanity, about capability, about the unconquerable nature of hope. When I stand in Virginia now, in the fields where that plantation once stood, I think about what's beneath my feet. Miles of tunnel, hand-dug, testimony to the most profound kind of resistance. When I hike in the Shenandoah Mountains, I look for that hidden valley, though I've never found it. But I know it's there. I know that somewhere in those hills, stone foundations still stand, slowly being reclaimed by forest, monuments to a community that survived by staying hidden and thrived by staying together. This story doesn't have a neat ending, because the best stories never do. The people of Canaan didn't all live happily ever after. Some struggled after leaving the mountain. Some faced violence in the world below. Some died young. Some lived long lives but hard ones. Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than the simple binary of enslaved versus free. But they faced that complicated freedom as people who freed themselves, and that made all the difference. The last surviving person who'd been part of the original escape died in 1932. Her name was Patience, and she was 6 years old when they went through the tunnel. She lived to be 91, long enough to see the 20th century, long enough to see cars and airplanes and radio. She gave an interview near the end of her life, and the interviewer asked her what she remembered most about that night in 1847. "The dark," she said. "It was so dark in that tunnel. I held my mama's hand so tight I thought I'd break her fingers. And I remember thinking we were going to be swallowed up, that we'd never see light again. But then we came out the other side, and there were stars, more stars than I'd ever seen. And my mama, she picked me up and she spun me around, and she said, 'Baby, we're free, we're free.' That was 82 years ago, but I can still feel it. That moment when the dark ended and the stars began." That's what this story is, really. It's about the moment when the dark ends and the stars begin. It's about the truth that darkness, no matter how deep, no matter how total it seems, is never permanent. It's about the people who refuse to accept the dark, who dig through it, who keep moving forward even when they can't see the end. It's about faith, not religious faith necessarily, though many of them had that too, but faith in the simple idea that effort matters, that persistence pays off, that impossible is just difficult stretched over time. So when you leave this story, when you go back to your life with its own challenges and tunnels to dig, I want you to carry something with you. Carry the image of Samuel holding that first shovel, looking at miles of earth between him and freedom, and digging anyway. Carry the image of Ruth screaming about a fire that didn't exist to save a plan 4 years in the making. Carry the image of 243 people walking through darkness towards a freedom they'd built with their own hands. Carry the image of a hidden town in the mountains, of children raised free, of a community that survived by refusing to give up. Carry Canaan. Carry the tunnel. Carry the truth that your ancestors, whoever they were, whatever they faced, had to be survivors for you to be here. And carry the knowledge that you're capable of more than you think, that your community is stronger than it appears, that patient, persistent effort can move mountains or tunnel through them. The lantern still swings somewhere, in memory, in story, in the hearts of descendants who know where they came from. And the tunnel still exists beneath Virginia soil, silent and dark and permanent, a testament to the truth that freedom isn't given, it's dug for, it's built, it's claimed by people brave enough to believe they deserve it. 250 people vanished in 60 minutes, and the world wondered how. Now you know. Now we all know. And in the knowing, in the remembering, in the telling and retelling of this impossible, beautiful, true story, they escape again. They're free again. They win again. And that, right there, is the most beautiful thing of all.